Welcome back to our study called The Signs of the Covenant, and we're looking at Genesis 17. Today we're in 10 through 14. And this one we called Signs That Confirm Faith. There's signs that God gives to confirm, to assure our faith. So let's talk about that today. And we'll see there's a new sign with Abraham here. In these verses we find the sign that God gave Abraham that represents the promises. This new sign would be circumcision. This sign was given to strengthen Abraham's faith in God. Just like the other signs God gave, this too would be a continual reminder of the faithfulness of God. The sign would be upon Abraham's own body this time. Instead of looking at the stars or seeing animals cut and stuff like that, this is going to be a sign that's actually on him. This would be a lifelong mark of God's ownership of Abraham and a reaffirmation of the promises. Think about it. It's on your body. You're not going to lose this sign, right? So what is the sign? Well, it's circumcision. And so you have that sign that would never leave him. It'd always be with him. It's a permanent mark on his body that it's not going to change. And so throughout his whole life, in his own flesh, he would have a reminder of what God was doing for him. The promises of the future, even beyond him. It's a reminder of that. So that's really cool that that happened. The stars are always going to be there too, but this is actually something marked on him, a continual reminder. Now let's look at the next section, and we'll see that the sign is the covenant. What do I mean by that? Well, as we read through this passage, you might find it a little confusing. Now in verse 10, God says that this is my covenant, circumcision. But we know from our study so far what the covenant is because God told Abraham what the covenant was when he was still living in Ur. So we already know what the covenant is. So he didn't say, hey, Abraham, circumcise. That wasn't all he said, right? He told him to go, leave your family, go sojourn. I'll give you the land I'm going to show you. He goes through all that stuff, and then it's further unfolded more and more. But this is the first time we've heard of circumcision. So we know that the sign is not completely the covenant, right? Because we have other stuff going on here. So it could be kind of confusing. Okay, so God is covenanted with children. God has given children covenant. He has covenanted children. He hasn't covenanted with children. He's covenanted children. He's given Abraham the promise of children. He's the promise of land. And that he would be Abraham's God and Abraham's descendants' God forever. That's the promise so far. That is the covenant. But now we have this. What's going on? Why did he say the covenant is circumcision? Well, look at verse 11. God says that circumcision is a sign of the covenant. Okay, wait, what? But then we get in 13 and 14, circumcision is the covenant in the flesh and a covenant that has been broken. So, what's going on? Well, verse 11 makes it clear that circumcision is a sign of the covenant, right? That one kind of stands alone. He says it is a sign of the covenant, not the covenant. But in other places he says it is the covenant. So, in our language it gets kind of hard. But by God using the language interchangeably here, he's making an inseparable link between the sign and the substance of the covenant. It's not the only place that we find this idea going on. Both Paul and Peter do the same thing. They do it about baptism and salvation. Baptism is not salvation. I don't care what people say. Being baptized does not mean you're saved. Baptism is not equal to salvation, but it is the sign of salvation. And they, Peter and Paul, in certain places use the language interchangeably to link the two together. That's where people get confused because they look and like, wow, it looks like Paul is saying that if you get baptized, you're saved. You need to repent, and you need to be baptized to be saved. And there's the passages where they kind of use that interchangeably, where the sign is equated to the covenant. But that's what God is doing here with Abraham too. So is the sign of circumcision, is that all the covenant is? Or is the covenant just circumcision now? Forget the other stuff. You just need to be circumcised. Is that what we're saying? No. What is the sign of the covenant? What does circumcision do here then? Well, circumcision in and of itself did nothing, really. I mean, circumcision was given in conjunction with the promise of God. That's why it's important. If it wasn't given with the promise of God, it doesn't really matter. Remember that Abraham was counted righteous because he believed God, not because he was circumcised. Paul makes that point, that he was circumcised after. That part of the covenant, the command, what you need to do, happened after he had already believed, after he had already been reckoned to be righteous because of his faith. The sign was given to Abraham and all of his household and his descendants to strengthen their faith that may be wavering. See, that's the point of the signs of circumcision, the other signs that God gave, is that you already have faith, but the faith might waver because of what's going on, because of the circumstances, the situations that they find themselves in. Maybe having to wait for God is causing that problem. So the signs here, the sign of the covenant is to strengthen him, to strengthen that faith. So the sign became a visible mark that the person belonged to that covenant. The sign created a community of believers. Okay, now you got a whole group of people that have been circumcised on the 8th day here, and it puts a separation wall between those who are in this community and those who are not. This is clear in verse 14 where it talks about being cut off, right? If you don't have the sign of circumcision, then you're cut off from the people of God. The sign pointed to the need for cleansing from sin because it required blood to be spilled. So here's another point. Here's what else the sign did. It was pointing to the fact that you needed to be cleansed. It pointed to the fact that blood has to be spilled. Finally, Romans 4:11 says, he received the sign of circumcision as a seal of the righteousness that he had by faith while he was what? Still uncircumcised. The purpose was to make him the father of all who believe without being circumcised, so that righteousness would be counted to them as well. So the sign pointed to the spiritual reality that had already occurred to him. Abraham was made righteous by faith, an invisible transformation, and the sign merely confirmed that visibly. It was a seal, a mark of ownership. And that's what, in the New Testament, that's what the Lord's Supper, and that's what baptism are talked about as well. It's a sign, a seal of something that's happened invisibly. You can't see what happens to you, what happens to your soul when you're saved. But baptism and following the commands of being baptized and following the command of taking the Lord's Supper, those show visibly to yourself and to other people what has happened invisibly, that you've been changed, that you've been saved, that you've been made righteous without being circumcised in the flesh. All right, now let's talk about what the sign did not do. What did the sign not do? Well, most of the nations in the Middle East at the time were practicing circumcision already. We know that from history. The only nation that wasn't really in the area that wasn't practicing circumcision was Philistia. Hence, you had the derogatory sayings in the Bible, especially from David, "You uncircumcised Philistine." Okay, he's pointing out that, hey, these guys aren't even practicing that cultural thing. They're definitely not in the covenant people of God. So the practice was, for most of the other countries, was usually done either on like pagan priests as a mark of their office, so they would get circumcised, or to boys as they entered puberty as a sign of manhood. So when that would happen, they would circumcise. That would show that you're now a man. But notice that God changed the practice. He's not following the cultural practices. God's telling Abraham, you got to do something different, because he's telling that every male in his household was received the sign, and any boy that is born in his house was received the mark at 8 days old. So it's not about being a priest or serving a pagan god, and because every man, whether you're a foreigner, born in this house or whatever, anyone that was in this community was to be circumcised, all the men. But it also wasn't for boys becoming men either, because it was done at 8 days old. So it also was not a sign of physical descent from Abraham as well. We see that verses 12 and 13 make that clear by saying that even foreigners that were not his offspring in his household were to receive the sign. So if they had some servants or whatever, and they were foreigners from a different country, and they were not circumcised, then if they were going to come into the house to be servants in his house, they would get circumcised. Okay, so and that would continue on. Even Ishmael, who was not the child of promise, received circumcision. So we find this idea throughout the history of the nation of Israel. At the time of writing, there were some Egyptians that left Egypt to join Israel and would have been circumcised. If you fast forward to the time of Esther, on the day that the Jews were vindicated, many people from all the provinces of the Persian Empire joined the Jews. They became Jews and received the sign of the covenant. They were circumcised on that day. So you have a bunch of men who were like, yeah, I mean, God is real. God is true, because look at what he's done. He saved his people. He saved the Israelites. He saved the Jewish people. I want to become a Jew. And so they submitted themselves to circumcision and became part of that covenant community. All right, so finally, the sign did not bring salvation. Okay? He was not saved because he was circumcised. Again, Paul makes that clear in Romans 4. He states that the faith and righteousness of Abraham came before the sign of circumcision was given. God did that on purpose. So Abraham became the prototype of all those that would be justified by faith, whether they were circumcised in the flesh or not, men or women. So circumcision didn't create faith in Abraham, but it only confirmed and established the faith that he already had. The same as the signs that Jesus gave to the church. Baptism, Lord's Supper, do not create faith, but they do strengthen the faith that is already there. They confirm in us that what God says is true. So that is the sign of the covenant. Circumcision did not bring salvation to Abraham, but it represented and strengthened, established, made faith that was there already, made it firmer, made it grow. And that was the point of circumcision. That was why everyone was circumcised. It really was, everyone was pointing to the fact that Abraham had faith and was declared righteous by faith. That's what the so you think about all these people were walking around with the sign that was pointing to the fact that Abraham had faith before he had to do anything. So pretty interesting. But that's what circumcision did. You can look at Paul in Romans. He has a lot more to say about that, about being circumcised of the heart, and that uses that kind of imagery too there. So he goes back to Abraham here and pulls that forward. Take a look at that. There's a lot more to learn about that idea of the signs and circumcision, and then even into the New Testament we have signs like baptism and the Lord's Supper and what those do for us. There's a lot of confusion about that. So take a look at that, study that, think about those things.